You're watching Public Affairs programming on C-SPAN. The House is in at 10 Eastern. They continue work on the 100-hour agenda. Today, they'll debate a measure to increase the minimum wage. Watch live House coverage. Washington Journal is next.
Newspapers report this morning that 15 National Guard units are expected to initially be involved in President Bush's new plan for Iraq. He'll make that speech at 9 o'clock tonight. You can watch it live on C-SPAN. You can also hear it on C-SPAN radio. We'll discuss the president's new plan on our Washington Journal program today, starting in a half hour with California Representative Lynn Woolsey. She is the co-founder of the Out of Iraq Caucus. At 8 o'clock, we'll discuss minimum wage legislation set for the House floor today. The plan would eventually raise the wage to $7.25 an hour. Republican Representative Buck McKeon of California and Democrat Representative Rob Andrews of New Jersey will be our guests. And then at 8:45, Representative Jim Saxon of the Armed Services Committee will be on to talk about Iraq. We'll finish up our program today with Charles Stimson of the Pentagon to discuss issues regarding the status and treatment of Guantanamo Bay detainees. For the next half hour, we want to get your calls on what you're hearing and reading about the president's new plan for Iraq. Here's the numbers: 202-737-0002 if you support Democrats, 202-737-0001 if you support President Bush, and 202-628-0205 if you support others. Again, we will be talking about the president's proposal for Iraq. Make those calls now. We will take them in just a moment. On the front page of the Miami Herald, one of several stories in the nation's newspapers today looking at the plan. Here's the headline: Bush's test sway nation on war. This is Ron Hutchison and Margaret Talev of McClatchy newspapers writing that story. Mr. Hutchison joins us on the phone. And Mr. Hutchison, in your estimation, what does the president have to accomplish tonight?
He's got a big task ahead of him, Pedro. He's got to convince the American people that we can win in Iraq, and that it's going to be worth the effort to do so.
And how does he plan to do that in his speech?
Well, the main task is to show that he's got a different approach here. I mean, everybody acknowledges, including the president, that the current strategy, the current tactics at least, aren't working in Iraq, and we got to find a different way. So what he needs to do is show the American public that he's fully aware that the old plan hasn't worked and that this new plan will work. And a big part of that will be, there's been so much attention on the troop surge, but it's going to be much broader than that. And so he'll want to show that this is a multifaceted approach that will include real efforts by the Iraqis to try to get the situation under control and get political reconciliation. It'll include diplomatic efforts by the United States to get Iraq's neighbors more involved. It will include reconstruction efforts within Iraq to try to ease the anti-American sentiment and bring people on board to the president's vision of a new Iraq. It would be a pretty sweeping plan. And of course, there's a lot of skepticism out there. So it's a tough challenge, and I don't think there's any question at this point that this is the issue that's going to define Bush's presidency and determine his legacy, and this may be his last chance to get it right.
Part of your story this morning talks about some international phone calls the president's been making.
Right. He called all of the countries that have, well, not all of the countries, but the countries that have the main participants in the coalition, which of course is starting with the United Kingdom. He called Prime Minister Blair, called the Prime Minister of Denmark, called the Prime Minister of Australia. With the same message. Let's face it, the coalition partners are getting a little shaky on this deal, and most of those leaders are facing pretty strong pushback from their folks at home. So he needs to reassure them that he's got a plan here that's going to be successful.
And this comes as both Republicans and Democrats have been commenting on this plan. What are the key people saying?
Well, the Democrats are in a tough spot because they were elected on a message of change, and it's not clear that they can or will do anything to make the president change course on the war. The proposal to add more troops is pretty controversial. The Democrats are looking at some way to block that without getting into a constitutional confrontation over their powers versus the powers of the president to wage war. I think the plan that's emerged just in the last couple of days is that they will will go for some sort of non-binding resolution just to indicate a sort of a sense of Congress resolution to indicate that there is not a lot of support for an increase in troops, and hope that that increases the political pressure on the president to drop that idea. Then there's also a more confrontational approach being advocated by Senator Kennedy that would actually seek to cut off the money for any increase in troops to force the president's hand. Although it's not even clear that would work because, first of all, there would almost certainly be court challenges to that, and the Pentagon has a lot of money that it could shuffle around from various accounts to try to carry out the president's wishes.
Has there been recent military response on this proposal?
You know, the response from the Pentagon is sort of mixed. There are some folks, including the new commanders, that both in Iraq and in Central Command that were announced this week, who support the president's proposal, and some of the commanders who are leaving don't. The military has said for quite some time now that Iraq will not be solved militarily. We can't win it just with our troops. If that were the case, this would have been over a long time ago. But it has to be a political solution involving the Iraqis. We've got to stop the sectarian violence. So that makes some of the commanders hesitant about putting more troops into the situation. Those who support it agree with the president that, well, you can't have political reconciliation unless you can impose some measure of security so that people can start participating in jobs programs, so that there's less reason to engage in some of the sectarian violence. It's basically to get the Iraqis to buy into the president's vision of a stable democracy that represents all of the various groups over there. And so that basic security is a benchmark before any of that can happen. So it's obviously a gamble. And one of the interesting things I think about this is the president, by definition, has to raise expectations. We're at a point now where most Americans don't think, or at least about half of Americans don't think that America can win in Iraq. And he's got to convince them that, and if you believe we can't win, why would you want to commit more troops? So the president has to raise expectations for victory, but the risk there, of course, is if we don't start seeing some results, the likely response is, well, that didn't work, let's get out, which, of course, is the last thing the president wants.
Ron Hutchison writes for McClatchy Newspapers. He's their White House correspondent. Thanks for your time this morning.
Thanks for having me.
David Cloud of the New York Times writes that the first active duty unit that is likely to move to Baghdad would be the brigade of the 82nd Airborne Division, now in Kuwait. Pentagon officials said Tuesday the elite light infantry of the brigade is especially useful in urban operations. Should Mr. Bush want other brigades to accelerate their arrival in Iraq, he will look to a brigade from the 3rd Infantry Division from Fort Stewart, Georgia, that is already set to head for Iraq later this month, but whose departure could be pushed up. The next brigade in line in Iraq is one from the 1st Infantry Division at Fort Hood, Texas, according to military officials. Again, we're going to talk about the president's new plan for Iraq. The numbers will be on your screen for you to call in this morning. Union, Kentucky, good morning. Go ahead.
Yes, sir, Rob. Good morning. First off, I have a young nephew that right now doesn't know whether he's in a National Guard unit and is unsure at this point whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan, but I would imagine from everything the press has been saying the last few days, it will be Iraq. So this is a close subject for me, as it is for so many Americans. The interview you just conducted, President Bush, where to begin? The President Bush seems to be doing a striptease, as many people have suggested, so he can pass off this disastrous failure to the next president. And the press seems to be helping him with this. The interview you just had with the fellow from the McClatchy Papers, the C-SPAN guest, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, Duffy from Time Magazine, it's like almost like listening to a Dr. Seuss novel read aloud. The absurdity of all this. The president has had 4 years. He's almost, one could say, the supreme leader of the entire planet Earth. And yet this man cannot figure a means to corral a country that's essentially offering its resistance in the form of sticks.
Okay.
Bomb.
Thank you, caller. Major point. Nashville, Tennessee. Good morning.
Good morning. This is the first time I've ever called you guys. I enjoy your programming. I think the previous caller is symptomatic of the problem in the United States that the president faces. And that is he doesn't understand that it's about culture clashes and values clashes, and that there's no specific indication to measure what a victory is, because this is not really a war. This is a waltz up to someone's, swish a handkerchief across their face, and then pirouette away to please Congress. In a war is about destruction, about killing, and about making them die in such immense quantities that they lose the will to fight. We have the capability of doing that in the United States, but I don't think the American public is capable of accepting that. It's the Vietnam syndrome at the dinner hour, and I believe that's what the Democratic Congress is hoping to capitalize on. If we really want a war and really want to win the war, we're capable of doing that in ways that nobody on this planet is willing to counter. And I don't believe that the United States public has the capability of accepting that at all. And I believe that slamming the president, this sounds ultra-conservative, it's not meant to be, but slamming the president in a time that is with a continuing war on terrorism ongoing.
Thank you, caller. The USA Today has a map showing where the main sources of activity will take place as part of this plan. There are two main areas in Sadr City, and if you go to the green zone, most of the activity will take place west, south, and east of the green zone. And that's a map that's been drawn up according to information that was gained from the American Enterprise Institute. The graph is courtesy of USA Today. Albuquerque, good morning.
Hey, good morning, Pedro. Heather Wilson has changed her position, and she's been a staunch supporter of President Bush all along, never veering from his policies yet since the Iraq occupation and the war has begun. But she's against sending 20,000 more troops. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the president was told it would take 450,000 troops, 20 troops for every 1,000 people to effectively win this war and occupy Iraq. He went against all advisors and went in with 130,000 troops. 20,000 more troops is a pittance, a mere pittance, and it will not make a difference in Iraq. What we're seeing here is the last-ditch effort of a very hard-headed and prideful president, and I'm very ashamed, having supported the president and being a native Texan, of his actions. He just refuses to take any advice from the 9/11 Commission or from this last group of advisors, Baker and the rest of them. He's a very hard-headed president, and what we're up against now is a situation, the last caller tend to blame the people's lack of will to win. Well, there is nothing to win there. We've ousted Saddam. We've run the Taliban out of power. What's left to win? This theory of bringing democracy to a country that doesn't want it, 5 minutes after we leave, Pedro, those people will either stand up and fight for their freedom, as this country's done several times, or they'll be divided into three different nations, which might be the best and highest thing for Iraq.
Our next call comes from Ontario, Canada.
Oh, I'm calling because I think you American people will have to stop Bush. He's acting just like the bully in the schoolyard that's taking away their lunch money. He has to be stopped, and he does not know anything about the culture of those poor people over in Iraq, and that the Republicans seem to be acting like they've got great big interests in oil and drugs and keeping those American people poor and neglecting their schooling. And then he'll have a lot of young lads uneducated and doing poorly to join the army. And that is sad, sad news. People in the States come up here in flocks and buy our Canadian flag, so they wear that when they travel abroad. And it is a sad state of affairs. Please stop him from sending any more troops. Enough is enough.
You heard Ron Hutchinson this morning reference some other aspects of the president's speech, including economic ones. Greg Jaffe and Yochi Dreesen write in the Wall Street Journal this morning about the United States pairing, according to the headline, reconstruction efforts in Iraq. They write that when he addresses the nation tonight, President Bush will propose a microfinance effort to aid Iraqi entrepreneurs and a sizable expansion of a program giving military commanders money for small-scale reconstruction and job creation projects, according to administration and Pentagon officials. Mr. Bush described both initiatives in closed-door meetings with senators this week, according to several participants. The administration also plans to spend just a few $1 billion on Iraq reconstruction in 2007. It plans to ask Congress for $1.46 billion in aid to the Iraqi government as part of Mr. Bush's new push to stabilize the country. though it will seek additional money for Iraqi security forces. No U.S. money is being set aside to reopen state-owned Iraqi factories, which employed about 12% of the Iraqi population in 2003. Instead, U.S. officials say they will push the Iraqi prime minister to find millions of dollars needed to open as many as 30 factories this year. Mr. Brinkley, who was quoted earlier, said the military would help the Iraqi enterprises by contracting with them for essentials like cement and water. Back to your calls, New York City.
Hey, Pedro, this administration is a bunch of chicken hawks. None of them actually fought in wars. And the Democrats are just chickens, period, because Joe Biden is talking about non-binding resolution. What about having some guts and making a binding resolution? But then again, you know, the government and the media know very well what they're doing. They're in bed with the corporatocracy, and they're making tremendous profits off of this government and off of all these wars we fight. So they know very well what we're doing, and it's all a scam.
West Silver Springs, West Virginia. Good morning. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm a first-time caller. Thank you. Full of rhetorical questions, really. One is why the American people seem to lack patience for any sort of extended effort in Iraq. I think it's been pointed out in a lot of newspapers and journals before that how long it took for recovery or some kind of economic effort after World War II and so forth. And the second point is if the United States were to completely withdraw from Iraq, I don't seem to hear anything from Democrats as to what the United States would be responding to this sort of ensuing chaos, or what's okay, if we pull out, it doesn't end there. So what is the United States position at that point? Thank you.
In the style section of the Washington Post, there's a story concerning looking at the terms that have been used in regard to this plan, surge, escalation, what have you. The author writes that surge, though, has no real history or meaning as a military construct, say unlike tank or M16. It doesn't appear in reference books as the Oxford Compilation to Military History, the Encyclopedia of the Vietnam War, the Encyclopedia of the U.S. Military, nor does it show up in the Department of Defense's official dictionary of military and associated terms. Quote, it just seems to be a term that cropped up that seemed useful, says Louis Sorley, a retired Army historian. Sorley notes that the word is politically savvy because surge seems to suggest a sharp but passing event. If you're trying to engender support from those who have doubts about the war, it's a useful word, he says, because this is a temporary event, it might be more palatable. That's in the Washington Post this morning. Battle Creek, Michigan.
Yes, hi, good morning. I know he's going to announce this new plan. I don't think it's going to be a new plan at all. He's just going to do some rearrangements. He's going to ask for more money. I just heard this morning on CNN News that he wants to ask for $1 billion in job programs for the Iraqis. We need jobs here. It seems to me he's putting more and more and more into this Iraq situation. He's failing to forget about the USA, the people he's here, that he was so-called elected to take care of. We're taking losses, billions of dollars. Nothing is getting done over there. He's going to send more troops. There's going to be more deaths. You know, it's just tragic. It's just crazy. Somebody needs to stop this man. He's totally out of control. They're bombing Somalia because supposedly that they're at the Al-Qaeda training camps. You don't want to go in Somalia. Did he forget about Black Hawk Down? You know, he needs to be stopped. He's out of control. Every new so-called policy or plan he comes up with, he's rearranging, he's shuffling around, and he's asking for more and more and more money. Where is all this money going? From what information I just read, that BP and Chevron and Exxon just signed some kind of involved drawing up of a thing where they can just extract oil out of Iraq.
The New York Post has some of the breakdowns of the plan. It says 5 brigades of U.S. troops, about 20,000 soldiers, will flow into Baghdad to quell sectarian violence. An additional 4,000 more troops will be dispatched to root out insurgents in Anbar province. And responsibility for security of all the country's provinces will be turned over to Iraqi forces by November. As far as the speech is concerned, the New York Post reports this morning that it is a planned 25-minute address that is scheduled for 9 o'clock tonight. Again, you can watch it live on C-SPAN, hear it on C-SPAN Radio. Turning to some other stories in the Washington Times this morning, Jerry Sieper writes that Samuel Berger's theft of documents from the National Archives compromised national security, quote, much more than originally disclosed, and resulted in incomplete and misleading information being given to the September 11 Commission, says the former chairman of the House Government Reform Committee. Quote, it is now clear that Mr. Berger was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to compromise national security, apparently for his own convenience. Representative Tom Davis of Virginia said yesterday, no one ever told the commission Mr. Berger had access to original documents he could have taken without detection. And it goes on to talk about more. Jerry Sieper has that story in the Washington Times. Cadwell, Georgia.
Hi. I guess I just have one comment to make. When these guys and women sign up for the military, they know that there's the possibility of going into war. If you don't want to go, don't sign up. And nobody would be out there complaining if the war was right here in the United States. They brought it to us. Bush went over there. Bush is trying to stop it. That's all I've got to say.
A headline in the New York Times, Jeff Zeleny and Carl Hulse write that Democrats plan symbolic votes against President's Iraq troop plan. We'll talk about more as our guests come through with the program starting in about 10 minutes with Representative Lynn Woolsey of California, Cincinnati, Ohio. Good morning.
Good morning, Pedro. Pedro, I'm a lifelong Republican. I have 2 children over the last 4 years who have been in college. And I am one of those who are fortunate enough to have received tens of thousands of dollars in tax cuts over the last 4 years. My family sacrifices nothing, while 25,000 other families have children that are wounded, disabled, and have lost their lives. A small segment of the American people sacrifice everything for this war, and the rest of us, Republicans like myself, have in fact benefited and have been asked to sacrifice absolutely nothing. This war is the greatest foreign policy blunder in our nation's history, and 70% of the American people now know it, and yet thousands of young men are going to continue to lose their lives and be maimed and injured for absolutely nothing because this president does not have the courage to tell the American people that he's made a tremendous blunder and reverse the policy in which we're going. I believe the Republican Party, if they do not stand up in the Congress and the Senate, the Republican Party, and tell this president to either stop this fiasco or have him removed from office, that our party is going to be destroyed over the next year, and in the next 2 years, you'll see a complete landslide worse than what this last election held.
Damascus, Virginia. Damascus, Virginia.
Okay, hi, yes. I'm a 4th grade school teacher down in Southwest Virginia. I had the privilege of speaking last year in December when the Iraqis were able to hold their own election, and subsequently, hopefully, their government will thrive. People in the U.S. need to be reminded of why we were bombed in the first place. If Bill Clinton had had any kind of foreign policy, if his national security advisor, Sandy Berger, had been doing his job and everyone else in his cabinet, this would not have all been landed on President Bush's lap. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
If you go to the website of the House Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer, you'll see the clock that has been talked about as part of the 100 Hours initiative that the Democrats proposed when they took power back in November. There's a story accompanying this by Mark Leibovich of the New York Times, and it shows a photo of Rob Corgano. He's a top aide in the House Majority Leader's office. Story goes that Rob Corgano is busy watching the clock, and not just any clock, it is the clock, at least as far as Capitol Hill is concerned. And early next week, maybe into late next week, depending on how long House Democrats decide it will run. Mr. Corgano's formal title is Floor Director for Representative Steny Hoyer of Maryland, the House Majority Leader, but for all practical purposes, he is the keeper of the clock. That is the digital timepiece on Mr. Hoyer's website marking the passage of legislative time as House Democrats push their 100 hours for a new direction agenda through Congress. He goes on to quote Mr. Corgano as saying, we're counting only legislative hours, In response to a question that he has volleyed repeatedly this week, legislative time, he explains, occurred when the House is in session and toiling at some official function, debating, voting, or doing anything related to making laws. It does not count designated periods in which members can bloviate on all matter of things, say the plumage of a state bird or the efforts of the national championship football team. In the event of a dispute, we decide what constitutes 100 hours, says Stacey Bernards, a Hoyer spokeswoman. Chiefly, Mr. Corgono decides it is a monumental charge. Again, a little bit more about that clock you'll find on the House Majority Leader's website. And again, Fords Creek, Michigan, as we finish up our calls, looking at the president's plan for Iraq.
Good morning.
Hi.
The one thing that I have trouble with the callers that say that Americans lack the will to stay in a war, I think Americans have proven in the past that we do have the will. But we don't like being lied to. We weren't misled. We didn't have bad intelligence. It was a setup start to finish. And another thing is you cannot run a war through jingoism. Slogans are wonderful. They get people's attention. They rally people. But slogans cannot be the policy. And in this administration, it seems that for lack of policy, they have slogans. I thought that the president would have been, in the last 3.5, 4 years, been getting the best and brightest information from everywhere, all along. But he only decided to supposedly do that after the elections. So it was like the day before the election, he was still cocky and arrogant. And then it was, oh, no, I don't know what I'm doing. Somebody help me. And he's retreated for 2 months, supposedly to come up with this grand new wonderful plan that I'm willing to bet a lot of money is simply more slogans, jingoism, and play acting to the American people. He swore on the Constitution. He's broken it. Something needs to be done.
Washington, D.C., you will be the last call. Good morning. Go ahead.
Yes, very good show. I have, opinion about that we had been misled. You know the Unabomber? He was in America, he was a scholar, and he killed around 15 people. And we could not trace him. And his brother and mother only got the, sense that he is their brother, and after publishing a letter in Washington Post. And now in Saddam's country, whether he was a culprit and everything has been proved now. And still, some people are believing we had been misled. He is paying $20,000 for people who are suicide bombers. Why we are policemen now, it has been forced on us to be the policemen of the world, and why we cannot pay our army, we deny to pay them to control them. We pay the police, how many millions of dollars, how many police are being killed every year to save us from the criminals. And why we cannot save us from those, again, there is a potentiality of 9/11. Why people are so impatient.
Okay, that'll be the last call that we will take on this topic. Joining us in just a few minutes will be Representative Lynn Woolsey of California to talk about the president's new plan for Iraq. First up, though, Alexander Bolton of the Hill newspaper here on Capitol Hill joins us. Mr. Bolton, could you give us a sense, besides today's and tonight's activities, what else is going to happen on the Hill this week?
Well, tomorrow the House is going to pass the stem cell research bill, which basically allow federal subsidies of stem cell research. And on Friday, they're going to pass a bill that would allow the Secretary of Health and Human Services to negotiate on behalf of all Medicare beneficiaries the prices of prescription drugs. In the Senate, the chamber is debating and voting on amendments to S1, which is the ethics bill that the Senate passed last year. Senator Harry Reid, the majority leader, and Mitch McConnell, the minority leader, have come up with a substitute bill that goes a little bit farther, but most eyes are on legislation sponsored by Barack Obama of Illinois and Russ Feingold of Wisconsin. Those two have offered the most far-reaching and sweeping ethics and lobbying reform bills we've seen so far. They would ban the use of corporate jets. They would really slow down the revolving door between government and the private sector by not only prohibiting contacts by former lawmakers turned lobbyists. They would prohibit all lobbying activities, even strategizing, that lawmakers and aides turned lobbyists have been doing in recent years immediately after they leave the Hill. It was considered a major loophole, but Obama and Feingold are shutting it down, or at least they want to, in the legislation they've offered as amendment to S1.
Besides the activity on the Hill, what are the hearings set for this week, and what are the major ones?
Well, today the Senate Finance Committee is going to consider amendments or add-ons to the minimum wage bill that the House is going to pass today. What the Finance Committee will be looking at are incentives for business and for Republicans to support the minimum wage hike. That could either be tax breaks for business or perhaps even a small business health plan. But what the Finance Committee is specifically looking at is potentially business-friendly tax cuts to add on to the minimum wage bill. The Foreign Relations Committee, headed by Senator Joe Biden, an aspirant for the White House in 2008, they are continuing their hearings assessing the situation on Iraq. Also in the Senate, the Intelligence Committee, which is likely to be a hot spot this year as Congress debates, for instance, what sorts of surveillance should occur of U.S. citizens, and also to try to improve the quality of intelligence overseas, and especially review the intelligence that Bush and congressional lawmakers saw before the invasion of Iraq. They're meeting today in a closed-door session.
Alexander Bolter writes for the